All right. Well, hopefully you can see how the McGurk effect is at play, where, we can look at what the person's mouth is looking like. And if the sound that's provided kind of matches it, it does look like that's what they're saying. So it's kind of funny. Anyway. All right. Cognitive psychology is fun, I think. Anyway, so embodied perception. So um, we're still talking about sensory interaction and the idea that, vision will take precedence. How about the fact that sometimes how our body is being used, what position it's in, what it's experienced can help to inform our perceptions, and sometimes in a faulty way. A lot of the things that we know about how perception works is based on illusions and mistakes that people make. And that reveals to us what they must be relying on in order for those mistakes to reliably occur, right? So embodied perception is kind of an example of that. So the research in embodied perception that has been well documented and replicated, one is when a person's tired, they tend to overestimate the slant of a hill that they've been assigned to climb. So they are given a little ruler that can estimate incline, and they're supposed to say how steep they think that hill is. And when they're tired, they tend to think it's steeper than if they're well rested. When a person's in pain, they overestimate how far the distance is that they've been assigned to walk. When a person is holding a heavy object, they tend to judge currencies around the world as being worth more than they do when the object that they're holding is lighter. It's as if that heavy object makes the currency heavier, like worth more. They tend to judge a target to be larger when the shot is going to be easy. It's close, or there's, they've got the right equipment, or other ways that they've made the shot seem easier. People tend to judge that center dot to be wider, a larger diameter than when they've been assigned a trickier shot. Maybe it's farther away, or some other thing makes it harder. Now, these are good, replicated, reliable examples of embodied perception. There have been other studies in this field that have been not only not replicated, but some of them have actually been shown to have been falsified. An example of that was a study where they had people sit in a messy room, and then they judged the trustworthiness of people who all they were shown was just headshots, basically. And some of the people in the headshots were black, some were white, and they reported that in a messy room, people judged black people to be less trustworthy. Well, come to find out, the study had been falsified. They had made up the data. And so, and it seems there was another one where they had people either down in the orchestra pit in the theater or standing on the stage in the theater. And they had to do a task with an imaginary, it turns out, but they believed there was a real person that they were competing against. And if the participant won this imaginary competition, they got to dole out Tabasco sauce to their imaginary opponent to drink. Sometimes the participant lost and they were assigned to drink Tabasco sauce. So they really thought they were competing against someone else. When they were standing on the stage, the study reported people doled out larger amounts of Tabasco sauce to their opponent. And when they were down in the orchestra pit, they doled out smaller amounts of Tabasco sauce. And so the interpretation was that when you're feeling higher than your opponent, because you're up on the stage, you will be harsher in your punishment than if you're feeling lower than your opponent while you're in the orchestra pit. Again, it was later revealed that the data had been falsified in that study. So embodied perception has really been a questionable area in cognition. It makes a lot of sense. And some of these studies, the 4 that I reported here, are well replicated and well supported. But for some reason, this is a topic that has attracted some shenanigans in the research. So you have to be really careful if you read something about embodied perception that maybe sounds overplayed or too stereotypical or something like that. You might want to hold off and see how it actually plays out, because it may not ultimately be supported. It might be too stereotypical, or it might be overplayed. All right, what about the relationship between consciousness and perception? So there are different types of consciousness. So for those of you who haven't studied this question before, it's kind of an interesting one, because we all kind of know what the word consciousness means, but then, as is always the case in psychology, a lot of times the words are used differently and stuff like that. So one type of consciousness is what we call access consciousness. And that would be what the cognitive system is actually doing. So it's finding information, comparing, templates, doing all these things that we're talking about. That would be access consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness is your awareness of your access consciousness. So if you're aware that you're busy trying to retrieve a name, or you're busy trying to figure out what that object is out in the distance, or whatever, you being aware of going through that process is called phenomenal consciousness. Monitoring consciousness is referred to our ability to reflect on our cognitive activities. Think about our process of storing information, our ability to think about our decision-making capabilities and stuff like that. And then self-consciousness is our general knowledge of ourself. I want to elaborate for a second on monitoring, that some of you may have heard monitoring consciousness referred to as meta consciousness, our awareness of our cognitive activities. So meta basically means awareness. So you might have heard that term before. So there's lots of different kinds of consciousness. And probably none of these, well, maybe self-consciousness you've heard before, but probably none of these are the simple, direct definition that most of us use the word consciousness in our everyday language, which would be like the degree of alertness. Like you can lose consciousness, you're in an altered state of consciousness when you're asleep or you're drunk, right? Like that's not part of these definitions, because we're talking here about cognition. We're not talking about states of consciousness. We're talking about cognition. Okay. So now that I've defined the different kinds of consciousness, let's return to something that I introduced in the first chapter, which is signal detection theory. So the likelihood of us correctly detecting a stimulus is based on, for one thing, the sensitivity of our sensory system. Okay, that's a complicated way of saying, how acute our hearing is, or how acute our vision is, how sensitive our sense of touch is. If you have a lot of calluses on your hand, maybe it would take a bigger touch for you to feel something with your fingertips, something like that. So the sensitivity of the sensory system. Response bias is another factor that determines whether you will perceive the stimulus or not. If you are willing to report the experience, you're willing to reflect on the experience, you're more likely to actually, have that perception. If you're trying to ignore information coming in through sensory, certain sensory organs, like maybe you're really trying to listen to something, you might be actively ignoring things coming in through touch or smell or sight, and because you're really actively trying to listen. And so that's a response bias also. I'm only paying attention to sound and I'm ignoring the other things. Most cognitions occur outside of our awareness. We have a lot of background thoughts and processes going on that don't require us to consciously pay attention to them, to, have that access consciousness where we're aware that it's going on. I mean, for one thing, thinking about your memory system is a great example. A lot of things go on in our memories and get tagged to different things without us having to even pay attention. A lot of our perceptions are like that. You don't deliberately say, let me search my features list to see if I've ever seen anything like this before. Like, you don't do that. It just automatically happens and does it outside of consciousness. And so sometimes we make mistakes because of that, because we're not deliberately trying to find a match. It's automatically happening. And when our system finds something that seems good enough, it may say, oh, the sound I'm hearing is, someone breaking into the room next door in the house, when in fact it's the dog rolling around in the bedroom and you didn't realize they'd gone in there and their legs are hitting the wall or something. which actually happened yesterday. My husband and I both were like, what was that? And then out comes the dog from the other room. We're like, oh, it was the dog. Hadn't even realized he was in there, right? But our monitoring of sounds happens automatically, and our brains jump to the scariest conclusion. Somebody was breaking in, right? So most of our cognitions are like that, including perceptions, right? Our ability to recognize things or process information happens automatically. So sometimes we have what are called dissociations in consciousness. I did not misspell the word dissociation. It's not supposed to be disassociation. That's a whole other concept. Dissociation means that you're having a break between what's happening inside of your head and what's happening outside in the world. Like there's a mismatch. I don't mean a break like you've had a psychotic break. I mean there's a disconnect between what's happening out in the world and what your brain is making in its own representation of what's going on in the world. So authorship processing would be processes that allow us to attribute outcomes to their cause. So this is what much of our brain power is spent doing, trying to figure out what caused what. Why did that happen? Who can I sue? Right? Like these are things that we spend a lot of time. Who can I blame? We try to figure out what caused an outcome. So authorship processing is all the different kinds of processes that contribute to us being able to ultimately attribute outcomes to their cause. This authorship processing contributes to our illusion of conscious control. It's called an illusion because we don't have as much control over outcomes or things as we would like to see. So this is really common in younger kids, but even as adults, sometimes we'll have this kind of, I'll just say magical thinking where, I'm thinking about it. It actually happens. Oh my gosh, I caused it. I just literally yesterday had an illusion of conscious control because my husband's an auxiliary firefighter, so he gets beeped if there's a fire or there's a car accident or something like that, and he runs to the station to help out. So a couple of days ago, we were coming home, and there had been an alert that came through, but his station wasn't activated on it. And so as we're driving on the freeway, I was saying, boy, I hope that the weather's going to stay cooler for the rest of the summer so that maybe we'll have fewer fires. That would be really awesome if it was winding down. And then right as I finished that sentence, his beeper went off and they were going to a 2-alarm fire, and it was time for him to run to the station and go help with the fire that I was hoping was small and wasn't moving. I'm like, dang it, I shouldn't have said anything. Well, does it matter if I said anything? I mean, the fire was what the fire was. It had nothing to do with me. Like, I did not have conscious control over that, right? But so I was telling that story yesterday to my mom, and I said, I was really starting to think that I made that beeper go off. And as I was telling the story, his beeper went off. And there was a fire. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got to stop saying fire. Now, I just told you, if his beeper goes off again, I'm sorry, that's 3 and I'm done. I'm in control of the fire. So I'm starting to get a little bit superstitious because it feels like every time I mention it, it causes his beeper to go off. So this tends to happen more often with little kids, but I would just like to argue I am not a little kid. And I also like to argue, I think pretty scientifically, I am the scientific principles teacher. I'm going to say that it's not just little kids. A lot of times our brain is trying to figure out, what causes what. And sometimes we come to the incorrect conclusion that somehow, a little superstitiously, we're causing things just because we thought about it or talked about it or whatever. So these are what we call magical beliefs that can kind of emerge from this illusion of conscious control. It can cause us to act in superstitious ways where we're like, well, I better knock on wood to make sure that it doesn't happen even though I was talking about it or whatever. Or I have to wear the same socks every time I play because I score a goal every time I'm wearing these socks. Things like that. It causes those kinds of superstitious behaviors when we have this incorrect, belief that we have conscious control over things that we don't actually have control over. It can also cause us to engage in what's called futile persistence. Some people pronounce it futile persistence, whichever way you want to pronounce it. What it describes is tendencies to stick with things even when you have no control over it. You think, man, I can figure this out and I'll have control. I can figure this out and I'll have control. There was a classic study on futile persistence, where they had a random series of lights that would appear on the computer screen, but they told the participants that they were not random, that in fact the participant could figure out the pattern and ultimately get control over the light pattern. And people would really stick with this task way longer than they should have, because it was in fact a random pattern. Nothing they were doing was having any effect on the pattern of the lights. But even as the researcher would come in and say, well, it's been an hour or so, we're going to go ahead and call the study. And they're like, no, I think I'm close. I'm about to break the code. And there is no code. But people will stick with stuff beyond when they should, because they incorrectly believe that they have control over things that they don't. So futile persistence. All right. So let's go ahead and take a break here. Hold on. Yeah, actually, I'm not going to break, because I'm just going to tell you what blind sight is and then let you watch the video. So blind sight is when you can't consciously see. You will say out loud, I don't see anything, but you actually can unconsciously see. So here's an example where the person says, I'm blind, I can't see any stripes. And then the researcher says, well, just guess. I mean, I'm telling you there are stripes on the screen. Do you think that they're vertical or horizontal? And the person goes, well, I guess horizontal. And they perform at a level that's above chance. So it's not just 50-50. They're operating at more like 95% accuracy. So it gives the impression that they probably are seeing at some level, but just not aware of what they're seeing. So this video here explains to you the concept of blind sight and shows you a person who actually has that skill.